Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarath Ranganathan. I'm the Stevenson Chair and Head of the Department of Paediatrics at the University of Melbourne, and also since 2004, a paediatric respiratory physician at the Royal Children's Hospital. And as your MC, I have great pleasure in welcoming you all here tonight to the launch of the Royal Children's Hospital Melbourne 150 Years of Caring publication. Thank you so much for joining with us as we hopefully offset some of the last vestiges of having to deal with Zoom meetings by joyfully celebrating the symbiosis of the relationship between the Royal Children's Hospital and the University of Melbourne. Now, you are all, of course, most important participants in this launch, but I'd especially like to welcome a few people. Professor Mark Cook, Chair of the Medical History Museum Advisory Committee, Professor Glenn Bowes, Emeritus Professor at the University of Melbourne, Sue Hunt and her team from the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation, including its chair, Peter Yates, AM, Ruth Braith and the Royal Children's Hospital Alumni Group, Sue Scott, League of Former Trainees, the Royal Children's Hospital Archive and Collections team, and all those who contributed to the Royal Children's Hospital Melbourne 150 Years of Caring publication. I'd also like to welcome my colleagues and friends at the Royal Children's Hospital and the University of Melbourne and its campus partners at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. So thank you for joining us. We have 6 wonderful speakers this evening. I'd like to welcome our speakers as well. Dr. Jacqueline Healy, Director of Faculty Museums, Dr. Peter Yule, who's a historian, Dr. Sarah McNabb, who's the Head of General Paediatrics at the Royal Children's Hospital, Professor Jane Gunn, the new Dean and my boss, Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, Bernadette McDonald, the new CEO of the Royal Children's Hospital and also my boss, and Shawana Andrews, Associate Director of the Post Centre for Indigenous Health and a Trollwulwe woman. Shawana has been a student at RCH and an Aboriginal family support worker there, an inaugural Koori mental health worker and Wadja policy officer and coordinator. So it's now my great pleasure to invite Shawana Andrews to give an acknowledgement of country. Thank you, Shawana.
Thanks so much, Sarath. And hello, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to acknowledge country this evening on this very exciting event. So as Sarath has mentioned, I am a Trollwulwe woman of northeastern Tasmania and currently working and living on Wurundjeri country. I do work at the university, but I've had a long association with the Royal Children's Hospital. It's where I started my career in social work, firstly as a student, and then as mentioned, as an Aboriginal support worker and subsequently other roles. During my time at the Children's Hospital, I worked with many Aboriginal children and their families over about 14 years. It is with these children and families and the many thousands of others who have come from Aboriginal lands all over Australia in mind that I offer this acknowledgement of country. To acknowledge country is to acknowledge place and relationship. The relationship between the RCH and Aboriginal communities has been a complex one. The RCH, as an institution that sits on Wurundjeri country, has spent many years reckoning with its history in relation to Aboriginal children and people. It is in this spirit of restorative reflection and action that I acknowledge country. I honour all Aboriginal children and their families and communities who have sought care at the RCH. I acknowledge all Aboriginal RCH staff and their allies, both past and present, who have worked tirelessly to make the RCH a safe place for Aboriginal children. And I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations upon whose lands the hospital sits, and also the lands from which you will join us this evening. I hope you enjoy the evening and thank you.
Thank you very much, Shawana, for such an inspiring acknowledgement of country. And I'd just like to give us a few seconds of pause to reflect on some of your words. Well, what a challenging 18 months we've all had in the health sector and broader community. But remarkably, the celebrations of the 150th anniversary of the Royal Children's Hospital have continued during this time, and they have been spread over 2020 and 2021. Various events organised by the Royal Children's Hospital and its foundation have been held to mark the occasion, including, for example, the RCH 150 anniversary postage stamp released with the Australia Post. I certainly have a collection of some of those. Me and UU, the RCH 150 anniversary art trail. Many of you would have followed the trail of UUs through our city and Geelong. Celebrate, Create, Connect, the RCH inspiring 150 Aboriginal art projects. The University of Melbourne purchased one of those UUs, Binga, by Josh Muir, and Binga will greet staff and students when they return to the Alan Gilbert building, and hopefully that return will be fairly soon. The publication we launched tonight is part of the University of Melbourne's contribution to this special anniversary. As many of us will be aware, the hospital was established in 1870. The university and the hospital have since been connected through clinical teaching, practitioners, researchers, and projects over that 150-year history. And the publication tonight highlights important events in RCH's history. Professor Glenn Bowes and myself led a project with Dr. Jacqueline Healy, the Director of Museums in the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences. Jackie led consultations with the RCH Foundation, the hospital alumni group, the League of Former Trainees, and the Royal Children's Hospital Archive and Collections Department. Staff in the Foundation and the Archives and Collections Department in particular, Lucy Beattie-Hughes and Emma Dacey contributed to the selection of materials, so we're particularly grateful to them. The team of experts representing the present and past staff of the RCH has collaborated with the university's Medical History Museum to produce the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, 150 years. I would now like to introduce Jackie Healy, Director of the Faculty Museums, to tell us a bit more about the publication. And Jackie will speak and introduce a short slideshow around this. So Jackie, please feel free to share your slides now.
I hope you can all see that.
Yes, we can see that fine.
Thank you. This is a remarkable object in the collection of the Medical History Museum, a pocket surgical kit in a leather case, embossed in gold on its cover, Herbert Hewlett from W. Snowball. In 1896, a young doctor, Herbert Hewlett, returned home to Melbourne after graduating in Edinburgh. Under the guidance of the recognised founder of paediatrics in Australia, Dr. Snowball, Hewlett established in 1897 the first radiology unit in a Melbourne public hospital at the Children's Hospital. This kit is evidence of the culture of collaboration and innovation at the Children's Hospital that is at the heart of the history of this venerable institution. Museums are not about objects or items, they are about people and their stories. At the Medical History Museum, we celebrate the stories of healthcare. The publication, The Royal Children's Hospital, 150 Years of Caring, tells the remarkable stories of people and events at the Children's Hospital through people intrinsically linked to the life of the hospital and the University of Melbourne. Various items illustrate these stories from the RCH Archives and Collections Department and the Australian Medical Association collection of the Medical History Museum. This has been a wonderful project of collaboration. As Sarath has just outlined, we have worked closely together with key groups from the Children's Hospital to develop an exhibition and publication. I'm going to take you through various themes in the publication. The publication is not encyclopedic. That was done by Peter Yule in his comprehensive account, The Royal Children's Hospital, A History of Faith, Science and Love. But this publication pays homage to many through acknowledging a selection of exemplars. I would like to start by thanking the many contributors to the publication. There are over 65 authors, health professionals, historians and family members, and some of you I know are listening this evening. It has been a pleasure working with you all. From its origins as an outpatient clinic in a small house in the city in 1870, the hospital has evolved into one of the world's leading paediatric hospitals. Professor Glenn Bow's introductory essay covers the long and entwined relationship between the hospital and the university in teaching and clinical research, culminating in the Melbourne Children's Campus. Professor Sarath Ranganathan puts together the vision for the future of paediatrics, one of strengthening research and accessibility to medical services through technology. And Peter Yule's essay gives us a rundown on the early history of the Royal Children's Hospital. These essays set the scene for the highlights that follow, which are grouped according to 6 themes: emblems, founders, buildings, individuals, turning points, community, and the future. There are many symbols over the years that have epitomized the value of the Royal Children's Hospital. The most enduring has been the coat of arms designed in the 1950s by the College of Arms in London, the process of its creation driven by Peter Jones, a leading paediatric surgeon. The symbol of the boy and girl have been reinvigorated in the 150th anniversary year with 2 patients, Akira and Kyle, depicted on the commemorative stamp. Sue Hunt talks of the role of the RCH in changing these children's life opportunities. The anniversary celebrations, as Sarath mentioned, included major art projects with works commissioned from Indigenous artists. Elders Auntie Jo Murphy and Nawit, Dr. Caroline Briggs, underline the cultural power of the project. Hospital founders, William Smith, John Singleton, and Francis Perry, were 3 individuals with a shared sense of social justice. These founders established a hospital that was to be transformed by William Snowball. Like many public hospitals in Melbourne, RCH began in buildings built for residential purposes. Peter Yule, Hugo Gold describe their attributes, while Mark Healy from Architect Space Smarts describes some of the environmental, technical and patient welfare features of RCH's current home. Many remarkable individuals contributed to the evolution of the RCH and its relationship with the University of Melbourne. Those highlighted here are exemplars representing the achievements of countless talented and committed people in all fields who have created the extensive range of health, teaching and research services at RCH. Dr. Mary Cowan, the first woman doctor to be employed there in 1899, is on the right. Further employment of women was slow to achieve, but it was the foresight of William Upjohn in the 1920s that broke the glass ceiling at RCH by enabling the employment of doctors Kate Campbell and Jean McNamara as residents. Recipient of the Upjohn Medal in 2002, Professor Richard Larkins comments on this initiative. At the RCH, McNamara first encountered the devastating consequences of polio and dedicated the majority of her career to the treatment and rehabilitation of children suffering from the disease. It was Dame Elizabeth Murdoch and Dr. Vernon Collins who led the hospital into a new era on the Parkville site in the late 1950s. Penny Fowler describes her grandmother's achievements, while Dr. Kevin Collins traces his father's, who was the first Stevenson Professor of Child Health. Bob Williamson acknowledges David Danks, first director of the Murdoch Institute, and Mike South speaks of Phelan's role in respiratory medicine. In the realms of clinical practice, research and teaching, there were many turning points at RCH. RCH led the training of nurses in pediatrics, and Sue Scott reveals the commitment of the early figures who introduced nurse training based on Nightingale principles. Infectious diseases have always been the major cause of sickness and death among children in Victoria. Professor Andrew Steer states simply, immunisation of children is the greatest public health success story in recent human history, and Victorian children have been the beneficiaries since community immunisation began here in 1932. Ruth Rath, president of the RCH alumni, points out that RCH was a leader in child psychotherapy, introducing a multidisciplinary approach with the work of Dr. John Williams and Ruth Drake. Over the last 150 years, RCH has continued to respond to community needs. Here are some examples: a pivotal change achieved by the establishment of the Wadja Aboriginal Support Unit, written about in the publication by Shawana Andrews and Dr. Jane Miller. Many of these initiatives have received funding through the RCH, the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation. The Teddy Bear Hospital is a volunteer student initiative established in 2009. This collaboration between the Royal Children's Hospital and the University of Melbourne is a unique educational program that benefits both children and healthcare students. Two of the students who run the program, Chelsea Zhu and Kate Wishart, have written about it in the publication. And what does the future hold? It will be shaped by research conducted by the Melbourne Children's Campus. And here we have, supported by new technologies. And finally, since 1879, the Royal Children's Hospital has played host to thousands of medical students taking their first dip into the world of paediatric medicine. I thought I might close my presentation with Karen Fay's words as he shares his delight at the training he received at the Children's. Trepidation quickly gives way to a sense of excitement and privilege as students are guided through the unique aspects, caring for children, learning that they are anything but little adults, and what to do when eventually faced with a crying patient. I hope you will enjoy the publication and exhibition, and I thank everyone who has been involved.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was excellent. As you say, history is about people, and you certainly showcased there some of the inspiring greats of healthcare from Victoria and elsewhere. So that was wonderful. Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Ewell. Peter is a research fellow of the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne and a contributor to the publication. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Sarath, and thanks everyone. Well, who would have imagined it? In December 1999, we had a big party to launch the last history, the grand cast of celebrities, all dressed up, speeches, party pies, and nobody went home thirsty. And this is how we launched the book for the 150th. Everyone's sitting home in their tracksuits. Well, we're all dressed up on top. I don't know what everyone else is wearing beneath the desks. The 1999 history was launched in the Ella Latham Theatre, which is named for one of the two most outstanding presidents in the hospital's history. The highlight of the evening was a speech by the other outstanding president, Dame Elizabeth Murdoch. She was then 91 and she talked for just 5 or 10 minutes. No notes, no prompts, but just beautifully structured and saying everything that needed to be said. That history, which I wrote, was very much Dame Elizabeth's project. In her quiet and undemonstrative way, she made it happen, as she made so many things happen at the hospital for about half of its history, from the 1920s until her death in 2012, aged 103. The Children's Hospital, I think, owes more to Dame Elizabeth Murdoch than can ever be recorded, from obtaining the land and the money to build the first hospital in Royal Park, to being the fairy godmother to the careers of generations of clinicians and researchers, to the foundation and support of the Murdoch Institute, and much, much more. She made a contribution to the hospital that really should never be forgotten. Elizabeth Murdoch first came to the Old Children's Hospital in Carlton in the early 1920s when she was still a schoolgirl. She told me that there was a prize offered of an escort tour of the hospital for knitting the most garments for patients, and she knitted night and day and won the prize. The visit to the hospital had a deep impact on her, not only seeing what was done for sick children, but also seeing how much more needed to be done. And then in 1933, at the age of just 25, she was invited to join the Committee of Management. Now, the Committee of Management, as it was structured for the first 100 years of the hospital, was a quite remarkable body. at a time when all other major hospitals, not just in Melbourne, but in Australia, were run either by the senior medical staff or by a committee of businessmen, entirely men. The Children's Hospital was run by a committee consisting entirely of women. It was not until 1940 that the government insisted that a male financial expert should join the committee. The first, I think, was Rupert Hamer, who told me he just sat in the corner and just slept while the women ran things unless they asked him a question. They'd give him a shake and ask him a question occasionally, but not often. And so he joined in 1940. Then in the late 1970s, government policy forced significant changes to the traditional structure of the committee. So we have a modern board. The Ladies Committee always showed great awareness of the needs of patients and remarkable business acumen in meeting those needs. The committee was self-appointed, self-perpetuating, undemocratic, elitist, non-accountable, remarkably efficient and enormously successful. Dame Elizabeth told me that membership of the committee was almost a full-time voluntary job, went far beyond attending just a monthly meeting. As well as all the functions of a modern board, the committee members were hands-on in the day-to-day running of the hospital. In the smaller hospital in Carlton, the committee members knew all the staff, as well as many of the long-term patients. When Dame Elizabeth first came to the hospital in the 1920s, it was barely 50 years old. It was still operating as a charity hospital, primarily for children from the slums of inner Melbourne. The hospital, as has been mentioned, was founded in 1870, the first children's hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. In the 1860s and 1870s, child mortality was high and rising in Melbourne. Over 20% of children born in Melbourne in the 1870s died before they reached the age of 5. Many children were permanently disabled by diseases such as osteomyelitis, tubercular bone diseases, and rheumatic fever. Malnutrition was common. Epidemic infectious diseases such as scarlet fever, whooping cough, measles, diphtheria, and typhoid were rampant. Children faced great danger from so-called medicines containing opium, arsenic, mercury, and even kerosene. Even the Medical Journal of Australia had an article in which it was recommended that a treatment for diphtheria was a teaspoon of turpentine taken every few hours. I don't know how many children that cured. Accidents and especially burns were common because safety regulations were few and candles were the main form of lighting, so fires were frequent. The hazards to infants and children were the greatest and the mortality the highest in the inner industrial suburbs of Melbourne. These areas were overcrowded, polluted, and insanitary. And they were populated by recent immigrants with weak family ties, erratic employment, and little or no education. Today, Victoria has one of the lowest child mortality rates in the world. Many diseases of childhood have been eliminated by immunisation, antibiotics, and improved public health. The mortality and morbidity from poisoning, burns, and other accidents has been steadily falling, and many formerly untreatable diseases and congenital conditions are now treatable. The Royal Children's Hospital has played a central role in all these developments. Its contribution to the improvement in child health has been enormous. The Children's Hospital has been responsible for more firsts than any other hospital in Australia. To mention just a few, and one has already been mentioned, it had the first X-ray unit, I believe, in any Australian hospital, and this was within 18 months of the discovery of X-rays in 1895. In 1944, Elizabeth Turner was the first doctor to treat a civilian patient using penicillin in Victoria. In 1947, she wrote the first article, I believe anywhere in the world, warning of the dangers of overuse of antibiotics, the potential problems that would lead to. In 1948, John Colbatch carried out the world's first controlled trial of chemotherapy for the treatment of leukemia. In 1955, Murray Clark set up Australia's first paediatric burns unit. In 1966, Bob Birrell and his brother published Australia's first report on child abuse. Ruth Bishop and her colleagues discovered the rotavirus in 1973, and many more. I could keep going for quite a while. The Royal Children's Hospital has also been in the forefront of campaigns to improve child health, from the fight for a pure milk supply in the early 1900s to the campaigns to ban fireworks and enforce flammability standards for children's nightwear. Over its history, the Children's Hospital has occupied 5 different sites, and you saw pictures of some of them in the previous presentation. Began in a small 2-storied building of just 6 rooms in Exhibition Street. Then it moved to a larger terrace house in Spring Street in 1873, before moving to Sir Redmond Barry's old mansion in Carlton in 1876, which was totally unsuitable for being a hospital, but it made do for many, many years. And over the next 50 years, what had been Sir Redmond's garden was covered with a hodgepodge of buildings, frequently described as resembling a rabbit warren. And some of the old red brick wards can still be seen along Rathdown and Pelham streets. When I was researching the history of the hospital, one moment really brought the old hospital to life for me. One evening I was driving with Howard Williams, who ranks with Vernon Collins as one of the most influential doctors in the hospital's history. I was taking Howard to an evening meeting of the Royal Historical Society on a topic that he was interested in. We were driving down Rathdown Street. He was telling me about his work in the 1930s on the treatment of babies with pyloric stenosis. We were a bit early, so we stopped outside the wards of the old hospital, where he had done his work 60 years before. And we sat there for 10 or 15 minutes while he reminisced. This actually had particular personal significance for me because in 1956, my wife's brother's life was saved by a doctor in Warrnambool who'd been taught how to treat pyloric stenosis by Howard Williams at the Children's Hospital. 40s. In 1954, Elizabeth Murdoch was asked by Ella Latham to succeed her as president. As Dame Elizabeth told me, it would never have entered Lady Latham's head to put the decision to a vote. The most pressing need was for a new hospital because the Carlton Hospital was overcrowded, dilapidated, and there was no room to expand. A new hospital had been planned since the early 1930s, but the Depression, the Second World War, and government action. It seemed that nothing would ever happen until Dame Elizabeth went to meet the newly elected Premier, Henry Bolte. This is in about 1955. Henry Bolte is not remembered as being a shrinking violet, but he quickly realised he'd met his match with Dame Elizabeth and agreed to provide both the money and the site for a new hospital. The first Parkville Hospital was opened by the Queen on the 25th of February 1963. I still just remember that because I was at primary school nearby and we were all lined up to wave at her car as it went past. Quite remarkably, the Queen was back again to open the present hospital in October 2011. But really, in terms of the hospital's history, the buildings are relatively unimportant. What makes the hospital are the people who work there and the people who volunteer there, and the ethos of caring for children with, as the hospital's motto says, faith, science and love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a wonderful reflection on the illustrious history of the Royal Children's Hospital. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Sarah McNabb as an example of the illustrious present of the hospital. Sarah is the first female director, remarkably, of general paediatrics at the Royal Children's Hospital. So I'd like to invite Sarah now to share her reflections as a current member of staff at the hospital. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks for having me. And I'm glad you said current. I thought for a little while that I was representing 150 years of staff at RCH and thought that that was too big a task. And it is an incredible privilege to be here tonight. And again, a huge undertaking to try and represent the numerous staff at RCH. So I'll just share some of my reflections on the time that I've been here. I first started working at RCH nearly 20 years ago, back in 2003. It was straight from my intern year. RCH was where I had wanted to be for a long time, so I didn't want to waste any time getting there. A good day at RCH is an absolute joy. There's no pretense with kids. They give you their true self whenever you walk in the room, and because of that, you have to be yourself when you're with kids, and we're let into their lives in such a unique way. It is an absolute privilege. A bad day at RCH makes you question the universe and your role in it, and it hurts. And I think that 150 years of staff would have cared for kids who have left an imprint in their hearts and permanently embedded and have shaped who they are. Alongside the patients, though, there are such joyous times with colleagues and with friends. I've tried to reflect, and I think the main things I think of are the night shifts and the, dancing and resis at 2 a.m. and, trying to make a birthday cake for a friend when you know you can't light the candles because it would set off the smoke detectors, so using glow-in-the-dark candles instead. I think it's the human side that makes RCH what it is. One of my striking memories on my very first week at RCH way back then, I was told, if you ever see something that isn't right, you speak up. So you speak up for safety at RCH. And I think that is part of why, we heard from Peter, the innovations that have happened at RCH. And I think that's because it is a place where people really strive to be better. I worked, of course, in the old hospital where I think my number one memory is waiting for the lifts that just never seemed to arrive. And then on to the new hospital, which even a decade on is just so extraordinary and so beautiful, a place that I think everybody is proud to work at. For me, my journey has been, again, from a very junior resident through my training, lured into a PhD at University of Melbourne. So I have a lot to be grateful to the Uni of Melbourne for. And then on to a consultant, as said, into my current position as Director of GenMed, and the absolute privilege of being the first female director, although also hoping that the next 150 years we have less firsts like that. It's a job that is interesting, it's different every single day, and it is a place where we truly can combine clinical care with research and with education, and that is part of an extraordinary opportunity because of the partnership that we have with University of Melbourne and with the Murdoch. So I think it's pretty clear I'm proud of where I work, and it's very much a part of my identity. I am acutely aware that I'm the beneficiary of all of the people that came before me. So for me, my little part of this book that was to write a segment on Ethel Colin, who was the very first female resident employed at RCH. She worked for, well, she didn't get a job at first, but when she did eventually get an opportunity, she worked for 18 months and then very soon after got married. So I suspect that she was part of society at the time, that after she was married and had children, she was no longer able to work in a role like that anymore. The contrast, and it may be a little bit too much information, but it's a paediatric hospital after all, is that when I was first rung to be offered my first permanent inpatient role at the hospital, my baby wouldn't stop crying, and I was sitting on the ground on the phone trying to breastfeed my child into being quiet. So I just think it is a testament to all of the people who have come before us, and for me in particular, particularly the women who've come before me. I don't think I can speak about my experience here without talking about the last nearly 2 years of the pandemic. And I think despite the very low number of children who fortunately have been affected by COVID, it's fortunate that it is a few, it has been an extraordinarily busy time, and it's been a time when we've handled a lot of anxiety and fear. But we've seen across the world what can happen when the whole world pulls in the same direction, and the same can be said for RCH. I think more so than ever, we've seen RCH at its very best. We've seen quick decisions, loads of support. We've seen trust. We've seen people say, can you do this, and can you do it quickly, and getting on and doing it, which has been great. So I guess RCH of the past 150 years has had innumerable challenges, and I think RCH of the next 150 years will have challenges that we can't even conceive. And I know that none of us will be here for the next 150 years, but I'm certainly proud and privileged that I have had been a small part of RCH's story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Wonderful reflections, and you're now part of that history, and the history is an exciting and diverse one that draws on a broad pool of talent. So well done on that small presentation. Now it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Jane Gunn, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, to officially launch the publication of the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, 150 Years of Caring. Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Sarath, and good evening, everyone. It's just an absolute pleasure to be here this evening to launch the online, or to be online and launch the exhibition and catalogue, the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, 150 years of caring. And I feel like Jackie Healy, that you can all enjoy that. I feel like I've stepped into the original hospital. I'd like to thank Shawana Andrews for her wonderful acknowledgement of country and her contribution to the Children's Hospital. So thanks for sharing that, Shawana. And I'd like to give you a sneak preview of the actual catalogue. And I'm sure that all of you who've attended this evening will just enjoy this, reading this so much. It is a note full of stories and expertise that you're going to really enjoy. But, you know, much has changed since Dr. William Smith and Dr. John Singleton founded the Hospital for Sick Children in 1870. And as Peter Yule said, it devastating mortality rates that led them to do exactly that. Now, the university's connection with the hospital is really deep and enduring. It formally began in 1879 when the hospital agreed to give medical students access to the wards. And I must say I was a beneficiary of that wise decision many years later. And I think when you think of the Royal Children's Hospital, as you heard in Sarah's wonderful talk just then, you just feel the emotion of the hospital. And even looking, you know, thinking about this evening, you just get filled with a great sense of purpose and how special the Children's is. And certainly I had that connection both as a medical student and then as a junior resident medical officer. But the relationship goes back a little bit further to Professor Helford, who was the first professor of medicine at the university. And Professor Helford was one of the first surgeon consultants appointed to the hospital. And he also has a link with Dr. Smith, who he employed as a demonstrator in the medical school upon his arrival back in Australia at the beginning of the hospital. So this publication, which, as I've said, is a great publication, it does explore the rich and enduring history between our two great organisations, the Royal Children's Hospital and the University of Melbourne. And it studies that from the beginnings in a small, modest house, as Peter has talked about, to the really extensive, globally recognised campus of today. And I really want to thank everybody that's been involved in this publication, Sarath Ranganathan and Professor Glenn Bowes, and hi Glenn if you're out there, for the role in putting this all together. And Jackie Healy, in true style, has put together a catalogue where the stories are very carefully chosen, and the way that the writer and the subject is linked is once again really well done to all of those involved. I also give special thanks to Sue Hunt and her team from the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation, the alumni group led by Ruth Wraith, and the League of Former Trainees led by Sue Scott. And I just love that name, the League of Former Trainees. It's a wonderful name in itself. And the Archive and Collections team for their involvement. But also call out more than 60 contributors that have put together these wonderful stories. And each of the contributors has a special story themselves and are intrinsically linked with the hospital. And I'm sure you will enjoy reading about that. The book draws heavily on Peter Yule's comprehensive account, The Royal Children's Hospital, A History of Faith, Science and Love, which was published in 1999. And I'm sure you'll see many links between the two. And there's a very strong and recurring theme about leadership by women, and we've heard some of those stories already, from the early matrons such as Sarah Bishop to the inspired leadership of the presidents of the hospital board, women such as Lady Latham and Dame Elizabeth Murdoch, who has left really fundamental changes to the contribution and standing of the hospital. I really like the way in the book that there are some key individuals that are writing about family members. So Penny Fowler writing about her grandmother, Dame Elizabeth Murdoch, Sarah Jones writing about her father, Peter, the leading paediatric surgeon, and the story of the coat of arms. And then Richard Southby, who writes on his father, Robert Southby's association with the hospital and the university as the first lecturer in paediatrics. And of course, the book is full, a catalogue is full of pivotal moments and turning points in the hospital's history. I like the way that Dr. Sarah McNabb, the first female director of general medicine, is writing about Dr. Cowan, the first woman doctor, and Professor Henry Urquhart, who surveys John Colbatch's achievements, which he then describes as laying the foundation for his own work on childhood leukemias. And of course, I think the really amazing account of Professor James Wilkinson around the pivotal moment of performing with Roger Mee and team the first heart transplant on 14-year-old Michael Safoulis in 1988. That was when I was a resident, and I remember that being a vivid thing happening in Melbourne at the time. Anne McCoy, a physiotherapist of 37 years, and I'm sure there's many long-standing dedicated staff at the Children's, writes about Jean McNamara's leadership in developing the field of physiotherapy from her experience of the polio epidemic. Look, there are so many things within the catalogue, and over the last 150 years, the Children's has really contributed to many social issues, really addressing the needs of the community. We've seen that in the COVID pandemic this year, over the last year or so. But you'll see that Professor Ian Anderson, a leader in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writings and our Indigenous person himself, discusses the hospital work and the way that it's contributed to the health for Indigenous children, which is also so important. And then we move to more contemporary times when Associate Professor Michelle Telfer outlines the leadership in medical care for trans and gender diverse children and adolescents. And then we come to the contribution by the chair of the hospital board, the Honourable Rob Knowles, who speculates about the way of the future and the fact that the hospital will be beyond the walls. And we're already seeing that with telehealth, digital care coordination and remote monitoring, and the way that children will be linked to the Children's from their home and community. So whatever the future brings, it is absolutely, I'm delighted to be involved in the enduring partnership between the university and the hospital, and that we have been able to work together in many ways, I think exhibited by in the little catalogue over the last 150 years, and we will continue to serve the community together for many, many years to come. I want to thank everyone and congratulate you all on a wonderful exhibition and catalogue. It's a shame this has to be online, but I'm delighted to say that on November the 29th, the Brownless Medical Library will throw open its doors. You'll make your way up the stairs to the Medical History Museum, where you will find the actual exhibition for you to visit. And I really do encourage you to go and take part in that. And now I would like to hand over to Bernadette McDonald, Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Children's Hospital, to say a few words, and really looking forward to shaping the future of our partnership, Bernadette. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, and good evening to everyone. As Jane said, I'm Bernadette McDonald, and I'm very proud to say that I am the new CEO of the Royal Children's Hospital. And it occurs to me that this is a great event to be involved in as I start my journey with the Royal Children's Hospital. I know I won't be here for 150 years, I'm pretty sure none of us will, but I hope to contribute a great deal to the history and the legacy of the hospital as we go forward and during my time here. As Jane said, I do want to acknowledge that we're not meeting face to face, and that is a little disappointing that we can't celebrate together, but hopefully we can in the future. For me personally, it is my first opportunity to meet and acknowledge so many significant partners in our hospital's history, and indeed our hospital's future. So despite being via Zoom, I'm hoping that my appreciation for this evening and for this book is felt by all of you somehow through the screen. We do really appreciate and are thankful for this piece of work. To Jane and Jackie, the collection and the history and the publication you've brought together is just outstanding, and I do look forward to coming and seeing it all in person. To have the history told through the voices of so many of our staff and supporters and partners, I think it really highlights the strength and depth of the community that has been built over the past 150 years. I have no doubt the publication will take pride of place next to Peter's own Brown book, I've been told it's called, which I have a copy of sitting in my office and I'm working my way through. It's akin to, Peter's book is akin to a Bible for those of us at the Royal Children's Hospital. To Jane, Sarath, Jackie and all of our colleagues and friends at the University of Melbourne, I really do want to thank you for this evening and the commemorative publication. But really more than that, the partnerships that have been formed over so many decades and have helped shape what we have become today. So thank you. We are proudly a world leader in children's health across the globe. And it goes without saying that this reputation could not have been built without the strong and enduring education partnerships that we enjoy with the University of Melbourne. We very much recognise our partners on the Melbourne Children's Campus and the important pillars that they represent through research, through the MCRI, education and research through the University of Melbourne, and of course the philanthropic support of the Royal Children's Foundation. These partners are integral to our future. They were in the past and they are integral to our future, and they're fundamental to our strong and proud history. So thank you again. We know it's not the end of the story, but a celebration of the journey so far. And I am so thankful to the University of Melbourne and each of our supporters watching tonight. And I hope you will all be with us to craft the stories of tomorrow. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. Wonderful words. Thank you also to all our speakers and to the audience for zooming in tonight. That completes our proceedings. I hope you enjoyed the launch as much as I did, and I hope you're looking forward to have a good peruse of the book. As we sign off, I ask you to contemplate perhaps what the next 150 years of our partnership will look like. Thank you again for joining us. It's been wonderful to have your company, and I sincerely hope that you have a good evening. All the best.